Hi there. Well, now let's talk about the integrated writing task on the TOEFL writing section of the test. And as I've mentioned in previous notes and previous lectures, the integrated task is all about your ability to read a passage, an academic related passage, pick out some key details from that, and then listen to a lecture related directly to that content. Decide whether the lecture is, supporting and exemplifying those ideas in the reading passage, or casting doubt on them and presenting an alternative view or alternative facts to sort of contradict that reading material. Now, the best way to kind of show you how this task works and what you should do is probably through use of an example. So I'm actually going to present a task for you, and you can sort of see how the material appears and see an example of how I would write a response for that material. So we'll start with a reading section, and I'm going to put that up on the screen for you in just a moment. When it appears, you may like to hit the pause button on your video and spend just 1 to 2 minutes reading it and taking some notes about it. It's shorter than the actual TOEFL because I'm trying to show you an example. It's about a third of the length of an actual reading passage on the TOEFL test, but it will serve as a good example for us. So I'm going to put the reading passage up now, and you might like to pause the video and just spend 1 to 2 minutes reading that passage. Okay, well, hopefully you've read the passage, you've taken down some notes about it, about this topic of influenza. I chose that because I think it's a bit of a current issue at the moment, and you may be somewhat familiar with it. And now we're going to present the listening portion of the set of materials, and I'm going to read that out for you. I'm not going to put it up on the screen right now because I want you to get some practice with actually handling a real listening passage. So as I'm reading out the lecture, I'd like you to try and take as many notes as you can. I'm going to speak somewhat slower than they do on the actual TOEFL to really sort of give you a good chance to get the details down. So let's get started. A very recent, in fact current, example of influenza pandemic is the swine flu pandemic, which broke out in 2009. Initially reported as originating in Mexico, by June 2009, it had spread to more than 60 countries globally, and almost 20,000 cases of infection and around 120 deaths have been documented. This latest flu pandemic follows the Hong Kong flu of 1968, which killed more than 1 million people globally, the Asian flu of 1957, responsible for 2 million deaths, and the infamous Spanish flu of 1918, which infected almost 1 billion people globally and resulted in somewhere between 20 and 100 million fatalities. So there's our lecture that follows up the reading passage. Again, it's shorter than the material that actually occurs in the TOEFL, but it's going to serve as a good demonstration for us. So hopefully you wrote down some notes based on that listening lecture. I do actually present the scripts for these lectures in my TOEFL Mentor program, but for now I hope you'll just try the lecture and take as many notes as you can based on it. And what we now have is a reading passage and a listening lecture. Now, in the actual TOEFL, after you listen to the lecture, the reading material appears back on your screen again, like this. And you're actually able to refer to it when you're writing your report. So you may like to skim back in the video at some point and actually bring up that screen again so that you can write your report. But what I'll show you now is how we write a report for that set of materials. Now, I'll ask you a question first. In your opinion, did the lecturer agree with the basic theories in the reading passage and support them and illustrate them? Or was it disagreeing and presenting an alternative view? Well, the answer is it was in agreement. It was an example of a set of materials that support and illustrate the theories in the reading passage or the information in the reading passage. So we've got a lecture that supports the reading passage. Now, how are we going to write this up? How are we going to present this in written form in our report? Well, first of all, we want to make a quick introduction. We want to show that we've understood the general topic, and we want to be able to show how the two sets of materials relate to each other. So here's the introduction that I would write for this report. The reading and lecture present the issue of influenza pandemics. The professor is drawing on current and previous examples of flu pandemics to illustrate the key characteristics of influenza pandemics presented in the initial reading passage. There's our quick introduction. We've stated what the general topic is for both sets of materials, and we've said what the professor is doing, the fact that he is supporting and illustrating these key characteristics that were written about in the reading passage. So, now we can start our first paragraph for our report. Now the key skill here is to basically write as much as you can about an idea from the lecture, and then relate that back to the reading. So here's an example. The first idea that we're going to present is what the professor talked about in terms of the current swine flu pandemic. The professor begins by relating some information about the current swine flu pandemic, which broke out in 2009. He states that this flu began in Mexico and rapidly spread to more than 60 countries, infecting more than 20,000 people and killing around 120 victims. This description of a current pandemic supports the characteristics of influenza pandemics stated in the reading passage. Namely, it is an epidemic influenza virus that spreads worldwide and infects a large amount of people. So that idea that the professor presented, that information, he gave specific information about the current pandemic, and then we just report as much of that as we can from the notes we took, and we relate it back to that information that was presented in the reading passage. We can go on and do it with another idea. In addition, the professor explains how the current pandemic follows up from 3 previous influenza pandemics. According to him, there were flu pandemics in 1968 and 1957 that killed millions of people, and a more severe one in 1918, called the Spanish flu, which claimed the lives of up to 100 million people and infected almost 1 billion people globally. This account of pandemic occurrence concurs with the point made in the reading that about 3 influenza pandemics happen each century, and they are irregular in comparison to regular seasonal outbreaks of influenza. Now, can you just see how I've just taken that information the lecturer has given us and I've just connected it with the reading? There's a lot more information from the lecture, and it's just connected to that information in the reading. Another thing you should note is that when you quote information from the reading passage, try not to write it word for word. Try to write it in a summarized way and try to use some of your own language. You need to paraphrase that information. If you just write it word for word, exactly as it appeared in the reading passage, you're guaranteed to get a minus on your score. The test assessors are very sensitive about that. So that's a very simple example. The actual TOEFL writing section in the integrated task will probably have a much longer reading passage and a much longer lecture, and there may be 1 or 2 more key points for you to integrate. But that should hopefully serve as a good example for you, and I'll put it all up as one unified script for you right now. And I want you to notice how I'm structuring the writing, but I also want you to have a careful look at some of the expressions that I use in terms of reporting what someone is saying and how I show that things are supporting or linked to each other. So have a careful look at that. We're almost out of time, so I'll leave it at that as our first example for an integrated writing task, and in the follow-up lecture to this I'll present another task which does the opposite thing. It presents a lecture that disagrees with our reading content, and I'll give you some more tips on basic writing strategies when I present that tutorial. So thanks for your attention, and I'll see you in the next video.